The emotional moment Princess Maelin rewarded the royal guards who protected her mother. I have been given medals in my time. I have stood at attention while a marshal of Eldermoor pinned a bar of ribbon to my chest and said words about valor that I have mostly forgotten. I do not say that to sound ungrateful. Medals matter. They tell a man his service was seen. But if you ask me, even now, years on, to name the single moment that told me my life's work had been worth the choosing, I would not point to any ribbon in the case on my wall. I would tell you about a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, in a walled garden behind the guardhouse at the Palace of Harrogate, when a 9-year-old girl in a paint-smudged pinafore stood on an overturned crate so she could see over our shoulders, cleared her throat the way she had clearly practiced in a mirror, and thanked 4 grown men and women for doing our jobs. My name is Corwin Ashby. I have worn the tunic of the Eldermoor Royal Guard for the better part of 15 years, the last 8 of them assigned, on and off, to the household of Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Elara. I want to tell you what happened with Princess Maelin, their daughter, because it is the truest thing I know about why anyone should want to do this work, and because I have never been able to explain it properly to anyone who was not there. I have tried. I always end up sounding as though I am describing something larger than it was. Perhaps I am. You can judge that for yourself. But to understand what she did, you first have to understand what came before it, and I promise you it is not the part of the story that matters most, even though it is the part most people ask about first. So I will tell it quickly, the way we were trained to move quickly toward what needs doing and away from what does not. It happened at the Autumn Charity Fair in Belmere Green, a market town half a day's ride from the palace, on a bright, ordinary Saturday. Princess Elara had gone to open the fair and walk the stalls, the way she did every year, shaking hands, admiring a prize marrow, letting a beekeeper's grandson explain his honey to her at painstaking length. I was on her detail that day, along with Sergeant Osric Dunmore, who has since retired, but was then the steadiest hand I have ever served under. Guardswoman Inez Calloway, who could read a crowd better than anyone I have known, and a younger guardsman named Tomas Fenwick, on his first season of close protection, and trying very hard not to show how nervous that made him. The crowd that day was larger than the town had planned for. A temporary barrier along the lane by the baked goods stalls, put up in a hurry the night before, was not anchored the way it should have been. When word went down the line that the princess was approaching, people surged forward all at once, the way water finds a low place in a wall, and the barrier gave. It was not an assault. It was not malice of any kind. It was simply too many well-meaning people wanting to see her, wanting to catch her eye, pressing without any of them quite realizing how hard they were pressing together. But a crowd does not need bad intentions to become dangerous. It only needs enough weight moving in the same direction. I remember the sound of the barrier's supports cracking before I understood what I was hearing. I remember Osric's voice, flat and enormous, cutting through the noise with a single word, and the 4 of us closing around Princess Elara before I had consciously decided to move at all. That is what the training is for, so that your body knows the shape of the work before your mind catches up to it. Inez took her left side. I took her right. Tomas came in low at her back, and Osric put himself squarely between her and the buckling barrier and simply became, for a few seconds, a wall himself. We walked her out through the gap by the flower stall, quickly but not running, because running would have told the crowd to panic, and a panicking crowd in that space would have been the real danger. She went down once, on the uneven cobbles, twisted her ankle, and scraped the heel of her hand, catching herself. That was the whole of it. No one else was seriously hurt either. 2 children got separated from their parents for a few frightened minutes and were found within the quarter hour, laughing again by the time their mothers reached them. The fair organizers rebuilt that barrier properly within the week, and it never happened again. I tell you all of this only so that you understand it was, in the end, a small thing. Frightening while it lasted, over almost as quickly as it began, and entirely without villains. Princess Elara herself made a point of saying so, more than once in the days after, that no one had meant any harm, that a crowd's love could turn clumsy without turning cruel, that she did not want anyone in Belmere Green blamed for wanting to see her. She rested her ankle for a week, wore a soft shoe for a fortnight, and by the time the leaves had properly turned she was walking the palace gardens again as though nothing had happened at all. She thanked the four of us formally, in the quiet, unhurried way she always did things, a private word to each of us, a note in her own hand delivered to the guardhouse a few days later, thanking us by name. It was more than most of the household ever received for a day's work, and we considered the matter closed. That is how these things are supposed to end. You do the work, the principal is safe, someone says thank you, and then everyone goes back to their lives, because a guard who is thanked too loudly or too often starts to believe the work is about being thanked, and that is a dangerous thing for a guard to believe. I should say a word here about what the training actually consists of, since it bears on everything that follows. We are not taught, in the Eldermoor Royal Guard, simply to stand still and look impressive, though I understand that is how the work appears from the outside, to a crowd of tourists watching a changing of the colors or a formal procession pass by. We are taught to read a space before we ever enter it, where the crowd is thickest, where a barrier is weakest, where a principal's line of sight will carry her, where a hand might reach from, where a shout might come from. We are taught to move as a single unit without needing to speak, so that four separate people, trained separately at separate times in separate years, can close around a fifth person in the space of a single held breath, each of us already knowing before we are told which quarter is ours to cover. It sounds almost mystical, described that way, and I promise you it is not. It is drilling, repeated so many hundreds of times that the body no longer consults the mind before it moves. That is what happened at Belmere Green. None of us decided, in any way a person could put into words, to do what we did. We had simply been made, through years of unglamorous repetition, into people whose bodies already knew. What none of us knew, what I certainly did not know, standing my post those next few weeks with nothing on my mind but the ordinary business of the household, was that someone else had been paying much closer attention than any of the adults around her realized. Someone small, who had not been at the fair that day, who had only heard the story second-hand from her mother in the careful, softened way you tell a child about a frightening thing that turned out all right. And that someone had decided, in her own 9-year-old way, that a private word and a note were not going to be enough. Princess Maelin was the second of the Crown Prince's children, a serious, watchful girl with her mother's steady eyes, and I would come to learn, a memory for detail that put most of the palace's own record-keepers to shame. I had known her since she was small enough to be carried on Osric's shoulders during the summer parades, and in the ordinary run of palace life, I saw her the way any guard sees the children of the household he serves, as a bright, occasional presence at the edge of his post, someone to be minded, to be kept from wandering too near the fountains, to be greeted with a small bow, and otherwise left to her own business. I did not, in those first weeks after Belmere Green, think of her as anyone with a plan. I began to suspect otherwise on a gray Thursday in the middle of that October, when I found her sitting cross-legged on the low wall outside the East Guardhouse, a sketchbook open on her knees, watching me with the particular unblinking attention that children reserve for things they have decided are important. "Guardsman Ashby," she said, in the formal little voice she used when she wanted to be taken seriously, "may I ask you a question for a project?" I told her she could, expecting something about the weather or my rifle, or whether I ever got tired of standing still, the usual questions. "What is your favorite thing to eat?" she said instead, pencil poised, "and do you have any family?" I answered honestly, if a little puzzled, that I was partial to gingerbread, that my mother still lived 2 counties east and wrote to me every month, and that my father, who had also served in the guard before me, had passed on some years before. She wrote all of it down with tremendous concentration, thanked me with the same formality she'd opened with, and skipped off toward the kitchens without further explanation. I thought little of it. Children ask strange questions and forget them within the hour. I had no reason yet to think this one would not. I mention this now because it was, though I did not know it at the time, the very beginning of everything that followed, the first small stitch in something she had already begun sewing together in her mind, long before any of the rest of us had the faintest idea what she was making. Over the following fortnight, one by one, she found the rest of us. Inez Calloway told me the whole of it herself, some weeks afterward, over a pot of tea in the guardhouse kitchen, and she told it with the particular relish of someone still faintly astonished at having been outmaneuvered by a 9-year-old. Maelin had cornered her in the stable yard, of all places, while Inez was crouched down checking a saddle strap, and had simply crouched down beside her, uninvited, and begun asking questions as though the two of them were mid-conversation already. She didn't even say hello first, Inez told me, shaking her head. She just crouched right down next to me and said, "Have you ever been frightened on duty?" The way another child might ask whether you'd ever eaten a whole cake by yourself. I nearly dropped the strap. Inez had considered lying, she admitted, telling the princess the polished, official answer, that a guard's training carries her past fear, that there is no room in the work for it. But something in the girl's face had stopped her. She wasn't asking to be told something reassuring, Inez said. She was asking because she actually wanted to know. I don't think anyone had ever asked me that and actually wanted to know before, not even my own mother. So Inez had told her the truth instead. That fear does not knock politely and wait to be let in during the moment itself. It waits outside, patient as anything, until the work is finished, and only then does it come in and sit down with you, usually somewhere quiet, usually alone, on the walk home or in the stillness after you have set down whatever you were carrying. Maelin had gone very still at that, Inez said, and had asked in a smaller voice than she'd used for anything else that day, whether that meant Inez had been frightened after Belmere Green too, once it was over. Inez told her yes. Maelin had nodded slowly, as though filing the answer away somewhere important, and then written something in her sketchbook that took up nearly half a page, tongue caught between her teeth the whole while, before thanking Inez with great formality and trotting off toward the kitchens without another word. Tomas Fenwick got the gentlest interrogation of all, though he did not realize at first that it was one. Maelin found him restringing a fence post near the kitchen garden on his afternoon off. He was always finding small jobs to make himself useful, being new enough still to feel he had to earn his place twice over, and simply sat down on the grass a few feet away and watched him work for a while before she spoke. "How old were you when you decided to become a guard?" she asked him eventually, and Tomas, startled to find a princess sitting cross-legged in the dirt beside him, told her he had been 7, that he'd watched a parade go by his window as a boy and never wanted to be anything else afterward. She asked whether he had been scared on his very first day of proper duty, and he told her, red to the ears, that he had been scared the whole first month, that he had practiced his salute in front of the mirror of his lodging house every night until his arm ached, terrified of getting it wrong in front of someone who mattered, and that the day of the fair had been the first time in his whole short career that he had ever done anything he felt truly counted for something. "What do you mean, counted?" she pressed him, and he found himself telling her more than he had told anyone, even Inez or Osric, that until Belmere Green he had only ever stood posts where nothing happened, long quiet hours at doors nobody opened and gates nobody tried, and that somewhere in those slow months he had begun to wonder, secretly, whether he would ever matter to anyone in this work at all, or whether he had simply chosen a life of standing very still and being looked past. Then the barrier had given way, and for 4 running, roaring seconds he had mattered more than he had ever mattered in his life, and he did not know how to explain to her that a person could be frightened out of his wits and grateful at the very same time. Maelin had looked at him for a long moment then, with an expression Tomas swore was far too grave for a child her age, and said, quite simply, "You matter to me," before turning back to her sketchbook as though she had not just undone the poor boy completely. He told me, laughing a little unsteadily even in the retelling, that he had needed a full minute alone behind the fence post before he trusted his voice enough to go back to work. Osric Dunmore, being Osric, gave the shortest and gruffest answers of anyone, and yet somehow ended up telling her the most. She found him in the guardhouse yard, polishing his boots with the slow, unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything, and she did not bother with any preamble at all. "Do you have a family, Sergeant Dunmore?" she asked, and he told her, without looking up from his boots, that he had 2 grown sons who thought his work was dull, and a wife who had stopped waiting up for him around the time their eldest was born, because 30 years of marriage to a guard teaches a woman to trust that he will come home rather than sit up worrying every night that he might not. Maelin considered this, and then asked whether he was ever afraid at his post, and Osric, who I do not believe had answered a personal question honestly in front of anyone but his wife in a decade, found himself telling her about the door frame, how he touched it with 2 fingers every single time he left his post, the same way his own father had touched a particular fence post on their farm every morning of his life. For luck or memory or some blend of the two, he had never bothered to untangle. He had never told a living soul that before, not even his sons. I asked him once, much later, why he had told a 9-year-old girl instead, and he only shrugged. In the way he shrugged at questions, he found the answer to slightly embarrassing, and said that she had asked the way you ask when the answer genuinely matters to you, and that very few people in his life, in 31 years of service, had ever asked him anything that way. As for me, she came back to me twice more that same fortnight, on excuses so thin I should have seen through them at once, if I had been paying proper attention. Once she asked whether guards ever got cold standing so still for so long, and whether we were allowed to move our toes inside our boots without anyone noticing. A question, I understood only much later, that she asked every single one of us, and recorded every single one of our answers to, as though it were the most vital intelligence in the kingdom. The second time, she asked about my father again, what kind of guard he had been, whether I had followed him into the guard because of him or in spite of him, whether I still had anything of his. That last question caught me somewhere I had not expected to be caught. I told her before I quite decided to, that I still had his old service ribbon in a drawer at my lodgings, and that I had never worn it because it felt like his to wear and not mine, but that I could not bring myself to put it away in a box either, so it simply lived in that drawer, where I saw it every morning when I dressed. She wrote that down too, slower than the rest, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, and did not ask anything else. I remember thinking, as she walked off toward the palace with her sketchbook hugged to her chest, that there was something almost professional in the care she took with these small facts, the unhurried attention of someone building toward a purpose she was not yet ready to explain. I did not guess what that purpose was. I want to be honest about that. If you had told me, standing at my post that gray afternoon, that a 9-year-old girl was quietly assembling the material for the most moving ceremony I would ever take part in, I would have smiled and said you had a fine imagination, and gone back to watching the gate. It was Princess Elara herself who first told me something was afoot, though even she did not yet know the shape of it. She found me on duty outside the East Wing a few days later, and I noticed, before she said a word, that she was fighting to keep a smile off her face in the particular way parents do when they are enjoying a secret at their child's expense and trying very hard not to spoil it. "Guardsman Ashby," she said, "I don't suppose you've noticed my daughter has become extremely interested in the Royal Guard of late." I admitted that I had noticed something of the sort. "She has been interrogating half the household," Elara said, with a seriousness you would not believe. I found 4 pages of notes on her desk last night. I only glanced at them, I promise you. She'd have my head if she knew, and I recognized your name and Osric's and Anis's and young Tomas's. Favorite foods. Families. What frightens you and what doesn't. I asked her what it was for, and she went very pink, and told me it was a secret, and that I was not to ask again, in a tone that would not have been out of place from her grandmother. Elara's smile finally won the battle it had been losing. I don't know what she's building, but I know my daughter, and when she goes quiet and careful like this, it is because something matters to her more than she has words for yet. Whatever it is, I'd be grateful if you'd let her have her secret a while longer. I think it's doing her good. I told her honestly that I had every intention of letting the princess keep whatever secret she pleased, and that if she wanted to know how cold my toes got on a winter watch, she was welcome to that intelligence as often as she liked. Elara laughed at that properly, and thanked me, and went on her way down the corridor with the particular light step of a mother who has just been given a glimpse of something good coming, and has decided not to look too closely at the wrapping. I want to pause here and say something about what that conversation meant to those of us on duty that autumn, because it is easy, telling the story afterward, to make it sound as though we all sensed something wonderful gathering on the horizon. We did not. We were guards. Our work does not lend itself to sensing things gather. It lends itself to standing very still and watching very closely for the one thing that might go wrong, and trusting that most days nothing will. If anything, in the weeks after Belmere Green, my own mind had drifted back toward something less warm than anticipation, toward the old, familiar unease that sits underneath this work no matter how many years you have done it, the knowledge that you had been fast enough this time, and the quiet, unspoken question of whether you would be fast enough the next. I do not think I am unusual in this. I think most of us carried some version of that same low hum through those weeks, Osric with his 2 fingers on the door frame, Inez with her eyes flicking to every doorway out of old habit, Tomas still replaying the crack of that barrier in his sleep, if his hollow eyes some mornings were anything to go by. We did not talk about it. Guards rarely do. But it was there, under everything, the way it always is. So when Princess Elara told me her daughter was building something out of that day, something made of gingerbread and old service ribbons and cold toes in winter boots, I did not yet understand what a gift that would turn out to be, not only to us, but to that quiet unease none of us had spoken aloud. I only knew that a small girl with a sketchbook had decided we mattered enough to ask about, and that this, on its own, was already more than the work usually gave back. It would be several more weeks before I understood just how far she meant to take it. I learned the next piece of it from the kitchens, which is not a source I would ordinarily cite for palace intelligence, but which turned out, in this case, to be entirely reliable. The head of the kitchen staff at Harrogate was a broad, unhurried woman named Greta Padmore, who had baked for 3 generations of the royal household, and had opinions about nearly everything that happened under her roof, most of them correct. I ran into her one November morning carrying a tray of spiced apple tarts down toward the guardhouse. A gift, she said, from the kitchens, though I noticed she would not quite meet my eye when she said it, and when I pressed her, laughing, on what exactly the kitchens were up to. She set the tray down, wiped her hands on her apron, and told me the whole of it, on the strict condition that I act surprised later. Princess Maelin, it turned out, had marched into the kitchen some 10 days earlier, sketchbook under one arm, and announced, with the gravity of a general laying out a campaign, that she wished to learn to bake gingerbread, properly, not the nursery kind, and that it was for a project of great importance which she was not at liberty to discuss. Greta, who had raised 3 children of her own and knew better than to argue with that particular tone of voice in a small person, had agreed on the spot, and the 2 of them had spent the better part of 3 afternoons since then elbow-deep in flour, with what Greta described fondly as more disasters than a battlefield and about the same amount of mess. The first batch, Greta told me, had come out of the oven black as coal, because Maelin had gotten so absorbed in deciding exactly how to arrange the little sugared decorations on top that she had entirely forgotten the timer, and the whole kitchen had filled with smoke thick enough to set off a fit of coughing in the scullery boy. Maelin had stood in front of the ruined tray, Greta said, utterly crestfallen, on the very edge of tears, until Greta had put a flowery hand on her shoulder and told her that every baker in the history of the world had burned a batch, and that the difference between a cook and a quitter was simply whether you put the next tray in. Maelin had wiped her eyes with the back of a flour-dusted hand, said, "Then I am not a quitter," in a voice of such fierce 9-year-old determination that Greta had to turn away to hide her own smile and put the next tray in. The second batch had come out better, if a little uneven. The third, Greta said, had been very nearly perfect, crisp at the edges, soft in the middle, smelling of cinnamon and ginger and the particular sweetness of a thing made with real care rather than mere skill. "She has her mother's patience," Greta told me, "and her father's stubbornness, and between the two of them I do not think there is anything that girl cannot do once she has set her mind to it. I only wish I knew what she had set it to." I did not know either, not yet, though I was beginning to form a guess, and the guess made something tighten pleasantly in my chest that I did not examine too closely at the time. The cards I learned still later, and from a different source entirely. My own sharp-eyed colleague Inez, who had seen more of the palace's hidden corners than any of us, and made it her business to notice things others missed. Inez told me she had come upon Maelin one wet afternoon in the small sitting room off the family's private apartments, cross-legged on the rug with a heap of colored paper, a box of pencils worn down to stubs, and an expression of ferocious concentration that Inez said reminded her, oddly, of the way we ourselves looked scanning a crowd. Inez had not meant to look, she had only put her head in to ask after a misplaced glove, but she had seen enough in that one glance to recognize 4 names written in careful, looping child's handwriting across the tops of 4 separate sheets of paper. Her own, Osric's, Tomas's, mine. "She's drawing us," Inez told me, in the flat, wondering tone she used for things that genuinely surprised her, which was not often. "Little pictures. I saw mine she'd drawn me on the fair day, standing by the princess's side, and underneath she'd written something. I didn't get a proper look before she covered it with her arm and told me very politely that it was a surprise and I was not permitted to see it yet. But Corwin, she'd drawn little details, things she couldn't have made up. My hair the way I actually wear it under the cap, the particular buttons on our tunics. She has been paying attention to us for months, in a way I don't think any of us noticed, because we were too busy paying attention to everything else." I thought about that a great deal in the days that followed the strange, humbling truth of it. We are trained in this work to be watchers who are not watched, to see everything and be seen as very little, a red tunic and a still face and nothing more, blending so completely into the furniture of palace life that most people who pass us 100 times could not tell you the color of our eyes. It is not an unhappy way to live. There is a kind of peace in it, a freedom from being noticed that some of us come to prize almost as much as the work itself. But there is also, if I am honest, a small cost that accumulates so slowly you rarely feel it happening, the cost of being, most days, furniture. Of doing the hardest thing you have ever done in your life, and having the moment pass, within the hour, into the ordinary business of everyone else's day, while you carry it home alone in your chest and set it down somewhere quiet, because there is no one waiting to ask you about it. I do not say this to complain. It is the nature of the work, and most of us chose it with open eyes. But it meant something entirely out of proportion to me, that gray November week, to learn that a 9-year-old girl had been looking closely enough, all along, to notice the particular way Inez wore her hair beneath her cap. It was around this time, the second week of November, if my memory of the season serves, that the trouble began, though trouble is too strong a word for what was, in the end, a very small and very human misunderstanding. The master of ceremonies at Harrogate in those years was a meticulous, well-meaning man named Aldous Pemberton, who had served the household for nearly 2 decades and took the business of protocol more seriously than almost anyone I have ever known. I do not say this unkindly. Palace life runs on protocol the way a ship runs on its rigging, and a man like Pemberton, who kept every knot properly tied, was worth 10 of anyone who found the rules tiresome. But he was also a man for whom the correct form of a thing mattered a very great deal, sometimes, I think, more than the feeling underneath it, not because he lacked feeling himself, but because he had spent so many years making sure the palace's public face was dignified and proper that he had come to believe, quite sincerely, that dignity and properness were the same thing as care. I learned, much later, why Pemberton felt so strongly about it, and I have never once been able to think of him the same way since. He told Prince Rowan, in the course of that same conversation about Maelin's project, a small piece of his own history that he had apparently never shared with anyone at Harrogate before. He had grown up the son of a household groundskeeper on a lesser country estate, and his own father, a quiet and capable man who had kept those grounds beautiful for 30 years, had gone entirely unthanked and unremarked by the family he served for the whole of his working life, right up until the week he died, when the family sent a wreath and a brief note of condolence and nothing more. No mention in any record, no acknowledgement before the neighborhood, nothing to show that 30 years of devoted, skillful work had mattered to anyone beyond the man's own family. Pemberton had entered service himself in part, he admitted to Rowan, because he had promised himself as a young man that if he ever held any influence over how a great household treated the people who served it, he would make certain no one's work vanished so completely and so silently again. It was, I think, a fine impulse, even if his first instinct, a grand ceremony, cameras, the palace record, was not, in this particular case, the shape gratitude needed to take. He had simply never had the chance, growing up, to learn what Maelin seemed to know instinctively, that the biggest gesture and the truest one are not always the same gesture, and that sometimes a father's whole life can be honored better by a single sincere sentence than by any wreath a great house can send. I think that is part of why he took his own eventual correction with such grace. Once Rowan explained it to him, he was not defending his pride. He was defending, in his own way, his father's memory, and once he understood that Maelin was trying to do exactly the same thing for 4 guards who were, thankfully, still very much alive to receive it, he let go of his grander plan without a shred of resentment, and gave what remained of it, the citation, the record, the news sheets, willingly, gladly, as the second tribute rather than the first. Pemberton discovered Maelin's project by accident, in the most ordinary way imaginable. He came upon her in the small stationary office off the household secretary's rooms, borrowing, with, I should say, entirely proper permission from the secretary herself, a supply of the heavy cream-colored paper usually reserved for formal invitations, and when he asked, in his politely officious way, what a young princess wanted with palace stationery, she told him, because it had not occurred to her that anyone would think to make it into anything other than what it plainly was. That she was writing letters to thank the guards who had protected her mother at Belmere Green, and that she meant to give them cards and biscuits she had baked herself, at a small gathering of her own arranging. I was not there for what followed, and I have had to piece it together since from several accounts, but the shape of it, everyone agrees, was this. Pemberton was, by every report, genuinely moved by what Maelin told him, moved enough that he went, within the hour, to Crown Prince Rowan himself, and said that, in his professional judgment, an act of gratitude of this significance deserved to be marked properly. A formal ceremony held in the great hall or the forecourt, with the household assembled, a citation read into the palace record, medals of commendation struck for the 4 of us, and this was the part that would prove to matter most, the palace's own appointed portraitist, and quite possibly an invitation extended to the kingdom's news sheets, so that the people of Eldermoor might see, as Pemberton put it, the house giving proper honor to those who serve it. It was, by every reasonable measure, a generous and well-intentioned suggestion, offered by a man who genuinely believed that 4 guards who had protected the Crown Prince's own wife deserved more than a 9-year-old's homemade thank-you cards. Prince Rowan, I am told, was inclined to agree with him, at least at first. It is not an unreasonable position. Guards are, in the ordinary run of things, thanked too little and too quietly, and a formal recognition would have cost the 4 of us nothing, and given the household a chance to say, publicly, that this work is seen and valued. I want to be fair to Pemberton here, because it would be easy to make him the villain of this story, and he was not one. He was a careful man trying, in his own careful way, to do something kind. The trouble was that no one thought, in that first conversation, to ask Maelin what she thought of it. She found out 3 days later, from her own mother, who told her gently, over breakfast, that her father and Master Pemberton had been discussing how best to honor the guards from the fair, and that there might be a grand ceremony after all, with the whole household present, and perhaps even a mention in the news sheets, so that everyone in Eldermoor could know what brave people had kept her safe. Elara meant it, I am certain, as good news, a mother telling her daughter that her instinct had been so right, so worth honoring, that the grown-ups wanted to make it bigger and grander still. Maelin did not take it that way at all. I heard what happened next from Elara herself, weeks later, when she finally told me the whole of the story from the family's side, and I have never forgotten the way her voice caught, even in the retelling, on the memory of her daughter's face. Maelin had gone very quiet at the breakfast table. Elara said, not sulking, not arguing, just quiet in a way that worried her far more than a tantrum would have, and had asked, in a small voice, whether that meant her cards would not be given after all. Elara had assured her that of course they would, that nothing about her cards needed to change, that this was simply an addition, something more on top of what she had already planned. And Maelin had looked at her mother with an expression Elara described as almost unbearably old for a child her age, and said, "But it won't be mine anymore. It'll be Master Pemberton's, and everyone will be looking at the cameras, and no one will be looking at the cookies." She did not cry, Elara said. That was somehow the part that troubled her most. Maelin simply excused herself from the table, went up to her room, and did not come down for the rest of the morning. When Elara went up to check on her, she found the box of cards and the tin of half-finished decorations pushed to the very back of a bottom drawer, and Maelin sitting at her window with her sketchbook closed in her lap, staring out at the garden with an expression of quiet, private defeat that Elara said she would remember for the rest of her life. "I have seen my daughter disappointed before," Elara told me. "Every child is now and then, and it passes. This was different." It was as though something she had built very carefully, with her own 2 hands, out of nothing but love, had been taken out of her hands and turned into something official before she had even finished making it. And she was too young to have the words for why that hurt, but old enough to feel every bit of the hurt itself. I think, looking back, that this was the true turning point of the whole story, not the fair at Belmere Green, which was only ever the spark, but this quiet, unwitnessed morning in a child's bedroom, when a small girl's private act of love very nearly became, through no one's malice, just another item on a palace calendar. If it had stayed that way, if the grown-ups around her had simply proceeded with their well-meant plan, medals and news sheets and all, and Maelin's own cards and cookies had quietly been folded into the ceremony as a charming footnote, a nice detail for the citation to mention, I do not think I would be telling you this story at all. I would remember, perhaps, a pleasant formal afternoon, a citation read aloud, a photograph in the news sheets. I would not remember it the way I remember what actually happened, because what actually happened only became possible once someone noticed that the little girl at the center of it all had gone quiet and asked her why. It was Crown Prince Rowan who noticed. He came home that evening. He had been at meetings on the far side of the palace all day, matters of state that had nothing to do with any of this, and found his daughter unusually subdued at dinner, pushing her food around her plate, answering questions with single words where she was ordinarily, Elara told me, a great chatterer at the table, full of small opinions about everything. He asked Elara about it once Maelin had been sent up to bed, and Elara told him what had happened at breakfast, and what she had found in that bottom drawer. I do not know exactly what passed through Prince Rowan's mind that night, and I would not presume to guess at it in detail. But I do know what he did the next morning, because it changed the shape of everything that followed, and because he told me himself much later, with a kind of rueful honesty I have always respected in him. He went to his daughter's room before breakfast, sat down on the edge of her bed, and asked her to tell him properly what she had been planning from the very beginning, not the version filtered through Pemberton's proposal or her mother's gentle summary, the whole of it in her own words. And Maelin, who had been guarding the secret so carefully for weeks, found that her father asking her directly, and sitting still long enough to actually listen to the answer, was more than her 9-year-old resolve could withstand, and the whole story came pouring out of her. The questions she had asked each of us, the notes she had kept, the cards she was drawing, the gingerbread, the burnt first tray, the plan to gather the four of us somewhere quiet and thank us properly in her own words, for keeping her mother safe. And underneath all of it, when he asked her gently what troubled her about Master Pemberton's grand ceremony, she said something that Rowan told me he had turned over in his mind many times since, because it had struck him as wiser than anything he had heard from any of his own counselors that season. She said that grown-up thank yous were often very big and very loud, and had a great many people watching, and that this made them feel like they were about honor in general, about the idea of a guard, the way a citation reads about duty and valor, without ever once mentioning that Guardsman Fenwick was frightened his whole first month, or that Guardsman Ashby still had his father's ribbon in a drawer he hadn't been able to close. She said she did not want to thank the idea of a guard. She wanted to thank Corwin and Osric and Inez and Tomas, the actual people, for the actual thing they had actually done, and she was afraid that if it became a grand ceremony, it would end up being about the palace thanking itself, and the actual people would get lost somewhere behind all the cameras. I have thought about that a great deal since, and I have decided that I have known very few adults capable of putting it half so clearly. Prince Rowan, to his enormous credit, did not tell his daughter she was being fanciful, or that Master Pemberton's plan was the more sensible one, or that a 9-year-old's homemade cards could not possibly carry the same weight as an official commendation. He told her instead that she was right, and that he was sorry it had taken him a day too long to ask her properly what she wanted, and that he would see to it that both things could happen, that the formal recognition Master Pemberton wanted to give us was a fine and generous idea and should go forward in its own time, at its own separate occasion the following month, with all its citations and cameras and dignity, because we had, in fact, earned that too. But that before any of that happened, she would have her own moment, small and private and entirely hers, with no cameras and no citation, and no one present but the four of us and her own family, exactly as she had first planned it. Maelin, he told me later, had thrown her arms around his neck so hard she nearly knocked the wind out of him, and had then immediately pulled back, wiped her face, and asked in her most businesslike tone whether he thought Tuesday would give her enough time to finish the gingerbread, because the current batch needed at least 2 more days to get the icing right. It fell to Prince Rowan himself to smooth matters with Master Pemberton, which he did, I am told, with a tact that left the old chamberlain not merely satisfied but genuinely touched. Rowan explained his daughter's reasoning to Pemberton nearly word for word, and Pemberton, who was, whatever his instinct toward grand occasions, a man of real feeling underneath his careful manners, was quiet for a long moment, and then said that he thought the princess had understood something about honor that 20 years in his post had somehow let him forget, and that he would be glad to hold his own ceremony a month later, and would consider it from now on the second and lesser tribute, not the first and greater one. He asked only one small favor in return, that he be allowed to stand at the edge of the garden, out of the way, and simply watch. Maelin, when this was relayed to her, considered the request with great seriousness and granted it, on the condition that Master Pemberton not bring so much as a single piece of formal stationery with him. None of this reached the four of us until much later, of course. To us, in those same weeks, nothing outward had changed at all. We stood our posts. We rotated our duties. Osric touched the door frame with 2 fingers on his way out each evening. Tomas grew a little steadier, a little less haunted around the eyes, as the memory of the fair settled further into the ordinary weight of things a guard carries and does not speak of. Inez noticed once or twice that Princess Maelin seemed to be avoiding the guardhouse rather more than she had been earlier that autumn, and remarked on it to me with a raised eyebrow, wondering aloud whether the project, whatever it was, had come to nothing after all. I told her I did not know, and I did not, and if I am honest, some quiet, unexamined part of me was a little disappointed by the thought that it might have. I did not know, of course, that the opposite was true, that behind the walls of the family's private apartments, a 9-year-old girl had simply gone back to work with renewed purpose, now that the thing was properly hers again. Greta, the kitchen mistress, told me, weeks after the fact, that the second round of baking had gone far better than the first. Maelin had approached it, she said, with the calm, methodical care of someone who had learned something important from her earlier failure, that a burnt tray was not a disaster but a lesson, and that the way through disappointment was simply to begin again, more carefully. She timed the ovens herself now, standing on a small step stool with Greta's old kitchen timer clutched in both hands, refusing to let anyone else watch it for her. She experimented with the icing until she found a shade of pale gold she declared, with great satisfaction, matched the buttons on the tunics exactly, and spent the better part of an afternoon piping 4 small, careful shapes onto 4 separate batches of biscuits, a tiny rifle for Osric, who she said stood like the barrier itself that day. A small flower, because Inez had steadied her mother by the flower stall. A little boot print for Tomas, because he came in fast, like he wasn't scared at all, even though Mama said everyone gets scared. And for me, a small drawn ribbon, the exact shape, Greta said, of an old service medal. I did not know, when I first saw that particular biscuit on the day itself, that she had asked her mother, weeks before, exactly what an old cavalry service ribbon from my father's era would have looked like, so that she could draw it correctly. Elara told me afterward that Maelin had spent nearly 20 minutes with an old book of household honors from the palace library, comparing shapes, dissatisfied with each attempt until she was certain she had it right. I think of that more often than almost anything else in this whole story. A child, with no obligation to get such a small detail correct, spending 20 careful minutes making sure she got it correct anyway, because it belonged to a man she had decided mattered. The cards took longer than the biscuits, by every account. Inez, who caught one more glimpse of the work in progress before Maelin firmly relocated her project to a room with a lockable door, said that each one was a small painted or penciled scene, done and redone many times over, the fair day itself, rendered not as the frightening thing it had briefly been, but as the safe thing it had ended up becoming. 4 figures in red standing close around a 5th in pale blue, with a crowd around them rendered as nothing more threatening than a smudge of soft color. Because Maelin, young as she was, seemed to understand instinctively that the point of the drawing was not to relive the fear, but to honor what had ended it. Beneath each picture in her careful, looping hand, she wrote a few lines, not a speech, not a citation, nothing that could have been read aloud at a formal ceremony without seeming almost too small for the occasion, but exactly the right size for what it actually was. I did not see mine until the day itself, and I will tell you what it said when I come to that part of the story, because I do not think I could do it justice out of its proper place. I will only say now that it took her, by Greta's estimate, the better part of 4 separate afternoons to get right, and that she discarded at least 3 earlier attempts before she was satisfied, each one folded carefully and kept rather than thrown away, tucked into a box under her bed that Elara discovered, with some private tears of her own, only after everything was finished. There was one further complication, small in itself but nearly serious enough to unravel the whole careful plan, and it arrived, as these things so often do, from the most mundane possible direction: the duty roster. The 4 of us who had been on Princess Elara's detail at Belmere Green were not, in the ordinary run of things, kept together as a fixed unit. Guards rotate. Assignments shift according to the needs of the household, the season, the calendar of state occasions, 100 considerations that have nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the practical business of keeping a large household properly staffed and rested. In the second week of that same November, the roster came down assigning Tomas Fenwick to a fortnight's detail at the far northern hunting lodge, accompanying a minor state visit that had been scheduled months in advance, and could not, in the ordinary course of things, be altered for the convenience of a 9-year-old's private ceremony, however dear the cause. Maelin, when she learned of this, I do not know from whom, though I suspect Denise, who had by then quietly appointed herself an unofficial ally to the whole project, without ever quite admitting as much, was, by every account, genuinely distressed. It was not simply a logistical inconvenience to her. Tomas had told her, in that first conversation by the fence post, that Belmere Green was the first time in his short career he had ever felt he mattered to anyone, and Maelin had apparently taken that confession very much to heart. The idea of holding her ceremony without him, of thanking 3 guards while the 4th stood a cold post at the northern lodge, unaware his own small act of courage had been the very thing that convinced a lonely young recruit he was not invisible after all, was, to her, close to unbearable. She did something about it in the only way available to a child of her rank and years, which is to say she asked, directly and without embarrassment, for help from someone who could actually change a roster. She went to her father a second time, and explained the problem with the same careful seriousness she brought to everything else in this project, and Rowan, who by this point had, I think, become rather thoroughly won over by the whole enterprise, spoke to the household's chief of security, and the roster was quietly adjusted, not through any grand exercise of royal privilege but through the ordinary, unglamorous mechanism of simply asking whether another guardsman of similar seniority might take the northern posting instead, and finding, as it turned out, that one was glad to, in exchange for a favor owed. Tomas never knew, until I told him myself, years afterward, quite how close he had come to missing his own reward, or quite how hard a 9-year-old girl had fought, in her small and entirely serious way, to make sure he did not. I tell you this small detail because I think it says something true about the whole of what she did, something that the ceremony itself, moving as it was, only confirmed. It would have been easy enough, faced with an unmovable roster, for a child to simply accept that 3 of the 4 guards could be thanked, and let the 4th's absence be excused as an unavoidable accident of duty. Most people of any age would have let it go. Maelin did not, and I do not think it occurred to her that letting it go was even an option, because to her the whole point had never been the ceremony itself, as an occasion to be checked off a calendar. The point was the 4 of us, specifically, individually, the actual people who had stood around her mother on an ordinary Saturday and made sure she came home. You cannot hold that kind of thank you for 3/4 of the people it belongs to and call it finished. She understood that instinctively, in a way I have watched grown men and women in far more powerful positions fail to understand for entire careers. There was, too, a small and rather comic near-disaster involving Maelin's younger brother, which I did not learn of until long afterward, and which I have always thought deserved to be part of the story, if only because it shows how close the whole careful secret came to unraveling from the most unlikely direction imaginable. Prince Bram, who was 6 that autumn and had never in his short life kept a secret for longer than the time it took him to cross a room, discovered the tin of finished gingerbread 3 days before the ceremony, left unwatched for a few unwise minutes on the sideboard in the family's private kitchen, while Maelin ran to fetch a fresh ribbon. By the time she returned, her small brother had worked the lid half off and eaten, by his own later confession, only 4, maybe 5 of the rifle-shaped biscuits meant for Sergeant Dunmore, and was in the process of explaining to their older brother, Prince Torin, with his mouth still full, that Maelin had been baking secret guard biscuits for weeks, and that he, Bram, had personally decided the rifle ones were the best. Torin, who at 11 had already developed something of his mother's steady calm and his father's instinct for quietly fixing things before they became larger problems, did not scold his brother, though Maelin, arriving in the doorway to find the tin ravaged and her secret halfway out of the bag, came as close to tears as she had at any point since the burnt first batch. Torin simply told Bram, with the particular older sibling authority that works on 6-year-olds far better than any adults, that he had eaten guard secrets, which was a very serious thing to have done, and that the only way to fix it was to promise, on his honor as a Prince of Eldermoor, never to breathe a word of it to a single living soul until Maelin herself gave him permission. Bram, delighted by the gravity of being sworn to a secret mission, agreed immediately, and by every account, kept his word admirably. Though he did, Torin told me later with a perfectly straight face, spend the better part of the following 3 days walking around the palace, informing anyone who would listen that he knew a very important secret that he absolutely could not tell them, which very nearly gave the whole thing away through sheer force of suggestion. Torin, for his part, quietly took over the task of guarding the biscuit tins for the remainder of that week, moving them to a locked cupboard in his own room each evening, and returning them each morning, without ever once asking to be thanked for it, and helped Maelin bake 1 small extra batch of the rifle biscuits to replace what Bram had eaten, standing beside her at the kitchen counter with the patient, unhurried attentiveness of an older brother who understood, without needing it explained to him, that this mattered to his sister more than almost anything had in a very long while. Maelin told her mother afterward, in the small, matter-of-fact way children deliver their most important observations, that she had always known Torin was kind, but that she had not known, until that week, that he was kind in the particular way that shows up only when no one is watching to give him credit for it. I think that is as fine a thing as I have ever heard one child say about another, and I include it here because it seems to me that whatever it was in Maelin that made her think to thank 4 guards so carefully, it did not come from nowhere. It was, in its own way, the family's habit, quietly passed down and quietly practiced, long before that particular Tuesday in the garden ever arrived. By the last week of November, everything was ready, though none of the 4 of us yet knew it. The cards were finished, chosen from among the many drafts and sealed, at Maelin's insistence, in small envelopes she had made herself out of the same cream-colored stationery she had originally borrowed for an entirely different purpose. The biscuits in their final and by all accounts triumphant form were baked, cooled, and packed into 4 small tins that Greta had helped her decorate with pressed autumn leaves under a layer of clear varnish. A date had been fixed, a Tuesday, chosen because the household calendar showed no other pressing engagements that afternoon, and because Maelin had a private fondness for Tuesdays that no one, including her, could entirely explain. And a place had been settled on, not the great hall, not the forecourt, not anywhere Master Pemberton's grander ceremony would eventually be held, but the small walled garden behind the East Guardhouse itself, The very patch of ground the four of us walked past every single day of our working lives without ever once thinking of it as anywhere significant at all. The only people who knew what was coming in those final days were the family, Master Pemberton, sworn to his agreement of silence and stationery-free attendance, and Greta Padmore in the kitchens, who guarded the secret of the biscuit tins as fiercely as any state matter she had ever kept. The four of us, Osric, Inez, Tomas, freshly and mysteriously returned to his ordinary rotation without explanation, and I myself remained entirely, blissfully unaware, going about the last week of an ordinary autumn exactly as we had gone about every week before it, never suspecting that a 9-year-old girl had spent the better part of 2 months turning a private gratitude into something none of us would ever forget. Elara told me, much later, about the evening before, which I have always thought belonged as much to the story as anything the rest of us witnessed, even though none of us were there to see it. Maelin had asked her mother, the night before the ceremony, to sit with her while she practiced what she meant to say, and Elara had settled into the armchair by her daughter's window, while Maelin stood in the middle of the room with her sketchbook held against her chest, exactly as she meant to hold it the following afternoon, and tried, 3 separate times, to begin. The first attempt came out, Elara said, in a rush, all in one breath, the words tumbling over one another so quickly that half of them lost their shape entirely before they reached the air. Maelin stopped herself halfway through, furious at her own tongue, and declared that it was ruined, that she would never get it right, that perhaps it would be better after all if Master Pemberton simply read something formal on her behalf, because at least a formal thing could be written down properly in advance and not fumbled in front of everyone. Elara did not rush to contradict her. She let her daughter sit with the frustration for a moment, the way I am told she always did, believing more in giving a feeling room to be fully felt than in smoothing it away too quickly. Then she asked Maelin a single question, whether she thought Sergeant Dunmore had known exactly the right words to say, that day at the fair, before he stepped between her mother and the breaking barrier. Maelin admitted that he almost certainly had not, that, from everything she had gathered in her interviews, none of us had thought about words at all in that moment, only about getting her mother safely through the gap by the flower stall. Then perhaps, Elara said, the words don't have to be perfect either. Perhaps they only have to be true and said by you, in your own voice, the way his hands were his own hands, and moved the way they moved because they were his. Maelin turned this over for a long while, sitting on the edge of her bed with her knees drawn up, and then tried a second time more slowly, and stumbled twice more over the line about Guardsman Ashby's ribbon, which she had rewritten, Elara said, at least 6 times in the preceding weeks, never quite satisfied that she had found the right way to say a thing so private about a man who had never told anyone but a 9-year-old girl that the ribbon existed at all. The second attempt was better, but Maelin still ended it near tears, insisting that Osric would think the biscuit shaped like a rifle was babyish, that Inez would find the flower silly, that the whole thing, examined honestly in the cold light of the night before, seemed suddenly like exactly the kind of gesture a grown-up might smile at politely and then quietly forget. It was Prince Rowan, coming in to say good night and finding his wife and daughter still awake, and his daughter close to tears over a speech she had been perfecting for 2 straight months, who said the thing that Elara told me afterward had finally settled her. He sat down on the end of the bed and told Maelin that he had given a great many speeches in his life, formal ones, written by clever people and polished until every word gleamed, and that he could not, if pressed, recall the exact wording of a single one of them a year later. But he told her that he still remembered, word for word, nearly 20 years on, a short and clumsy thing his own grandmother had once said to him after a difficult week when he was a boy not much older than Torin, not because it had been eloquent, but because it had been entirely, unmistakably meant. He told his daughter that the guards she meant to thank the next day did not need her to be eloquent. They needed her to mean it, and she had never in her life had any trouble at all doing that. Maelin tried a third time that night, Elara said, more slowly still, and did not once break down, though her voice wavered more than once. And by the end of it, both her parents were fighting their own composure rather harder than either of them expected to be fighting it over a 9-year-old's rehearsal. Elara told me she went to bed that night with the strange, humbled feeling of having witnessed something she did not entirely have words for yet herself, and that she woke the next morning half convinced she had dreamed the whole conversation, until she came down to breakfast and found her daughter already up, already dressed, sketchbook already tucked under one arm, asking whether anyone had seen where she had left the blue ribbon for Guardsman Ashby's tin. The Tuesday itself began, for me, exactly as 100 other Tuesdays had begun. I dressed before dawn, in the small room I still kept in the guards' lodging house at the edge of the palace grounds, and I remember, because I have thought back to it so many times since, that I opened the same drawer I opened every morning and saw, as I always saw, my father's old service ribbon lying folded in its square of tissue paper, and that I closed the drawer the way I always closed it, without taking it out, the way I had done every morning for years. I had no reason that morning to think the day would be any different from the one before it. Word came down to the guardhouse a little after midday, relayed by Sergeant Osric Dunmore himself, that the 4 of us who had served on Princess Elara's detail at Belmere Green, myself, Osric, Inez, and Tomas, were to report, off-duty and out of uniform if we preferred, to the walled garden behind the East Guardhouse at 4 o'clock that afternoon, on the personal request of the household. No further explanation was given. Osric, who I later learned had in fact been told the whole of it in confidence the day before, so that he might make sure none of us were pulled onto some other duty at the critical hour, gave nothing away. He only said, in his flat, unreadable way, that we were to be there, and that we were not to be late, which from Osric was so entirely ordinary an instruction that none of us thought twice about it. I remember Inez catching my eye as we walked toward the garden that afternoon and saying, in a low voice, that she had a feeling about this, though she could not say what kind. Tomas, walking a half-step behind us, still fresh from his unexplained reprieve from the northern posting, and none the wiser as to why it had happened, admitted he'd wondered all week if he was in some kind of trouble, and had spent altogether too much of the past several days going back over his own conduct looking for the fault. Osric said nothing at all, which we all should have taken as its own kind of clue, since a man who has kept a secret for 2 weeks tends to go very quiet indeed on the day it is finally due to come out. The garden behind the East Guardhouse is not a grand place. It is a small, walled square of green, planted mostly with hardy autumn roses and a single old apple tree that had, by that point in the season, dropped most of its leaves, so that the low afternoon light came down through its bare branches in soft, scattered patterns across the grass. It is the kind of place that exists in every large household, not decorative enough for state occasions, not private enough to be anyone's alone, simply a patch of quiet ground that the working life of the palace passes by a dozen times a day without ever quite noticing it. When the 4 of us came through the garden gate that afternoon, we found it transformed, in its own small and entirely unofficial way, into something else. There were no banners, there was no dais, no formal seating, none of the trappings I had half expected, given how mysterious the summons had been. There was a single long trestle table, borrowed, I would learn, from the kitchens, covered in a plain white cloth, with 4 small tins arranged along it, each one tied with a different colored ribbon, and beside each tin a single sealed envelope of cream-colored paper. Standing at the far end of the garden near the old apple tree were Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Elara, Elara leaning very slightly on a cane she no longer strictly needed but had, I noticed, brought anyway, and beside them, hovering at a respectful distance near the wall exactly as he had promised, Master Aldous Pemberton, empty-handed, without so much as a notebook. watching with an expression I had genuinely never seen on his face before, a kind of soft, unguarded attention. Entirely unlike the careful formality he wore to every other occasion I had ever known him to attend. And standing on an overturned wooden crate in the middle of it all, so that she might be tall enough to see the four of us properly as we came through the gate, was Princess Maelin, in a plain blue pinafore with a faint dusting of flour still visible along one sleeve that no amount of scrubbing had entirely removed, her sketchbook clutched to her chest with both arms, and an expression on her face that I can only describe as the particular, trembling mixture of terror and determination that belongs, I think, only to children about to do something that matters enormously to them, and that no one has ever taught them the proper way to do. She waited until all four of us had come fully into the garden, and the gate had swung shut behind Tomas, the last of us through. Then she cleared her throat. I heard it, that small, deliberate sound, the one I would come to think of afterward as the true beginning of the whole ceremony, and began to speak, in a voice that started small and grew steadier as she went, the way a fire grows steadier once it is caught properly. "I asked you all to come here today," she said, "because I have something I need to give you, and I did not want to do it in front of the whole palace, because it isn't about the whole palace. It's about you." She looked down at her sketchbook, then back up at us, and I saw her take a breath the way you take a breath before diving into cold water. "My mother was frightened at Belmere Green," she said. "I wasn't there, so I don't know exactly what it was like, but I know a crowd fell against a fence and everyone was pushing and it was loud and no one meant to hurt her but it could have. And I know that you," she looked at Osric, "stood in front of her like a wall. And you, Inez, kept her steady when the ground wasn't. And you, Tomas, who I saw swallow hard, came in low and fast even though it was only your first season and you must have been so scared. And you," she looked at me last, and I felt something in my chest go very still. "You were on her other side the whole way, and you didn't let go until she was safe in the carriage, even though your hand was bleeding a little from the fence, and nobody even noticed that but me, because Mama told me, because you never said anything about it to anyone." I had, in fact, cut my palm on a splintered edge of the broken barrier that day, a small thing, hardly worth mentioning, bandaged and forgotten within the hour. I had genuinely never told anyone but Elara, in passing, weeks later, when she asked after a faint scar she'd noticed. I had not known Maelin knew. "Everyone keeps saying thank you to guards in general," she went on, her voice steadier now, finding its rhythm. "There are statues and medals and words like valor and duty that go on plaques, and I think those are important too, and Master Pemberton is going to give you a proper ceremony next month with all of that, and I think that's good and you deserve it. But I didn't want the first thank you to be about a guard. I wanted it to be about you, because you're not just a guard to me. You're Sergeant Dunmore, who touches the door frame with 2 fingers for luck every single night because his father did the same thing on their farm. And you're Guardswoman Calloway, who isn't scared while it's happening and only lets herself feel it afterward, on the way home, alone, and I think that's the bravest kind of scared there is. And your Guardsman Fenwick, who told me that before that day he'd never done anything he thought mattered, and I want you to know that you were wrong because you always mattered, you just didn't know it yet. And your Guardsman Ashby, whose father was a guard too, and who still has his ribbon in a drawer because he hasn't decided yet whether he's allowed to be proud of it. I think you are. I think you're allowed. I will tell you plainly that by this point I was no longer entirely in command of my own composure, and I was not the only one. I glanced sideways at Tomas, and saw his jaw working the way a young man's jaw works when he is fighting with everything he has not to cry in front of his colleagues, and losing. Inez had gone very still and very pale, the way she went in the moments right before action, except there was no action here to take, only a 9-year-old girl's words to stand and receive. Even Osric, 31 years a guard, a man I had genuinely never once seen show more emotion than a slight narrowing of the eyes, had his jaw set hard against something, and his eyes, when I dared look at them, were unmistakably bright. Maelin climbed carefully down off her crate, sketchbook still clutched in one arm, and went to the table. She picked up the first envelope in the first tin, the one tied with a green ribbon, and walked it over to Osric herself, standing very straight in front of him, coming barely to the middle of his chest, and held them up to him with both hands. "This is yours," she said. "I drew you standing in front of Mama like the barrier itself, because that's what it looked like when Mama described it to me. And I made you gingerbread shaped like your rifle, because Greta said that's silly and I should do something nicer, but I told her I thought you'd like it better this way, and I hope I was right." Osric took the tin and the envelope from her with hands that were, I noticed, not quite steady, and said, in a voice gone rough and low, that she had been exactly right, and that in 31 years no one had ever given him a gift that meant more to him than a tin of biscuits shaped like a rifle, and that he intended to keep the card for the rest of his life. He did not open it there, in front of everyone. None of us did. I think we all understood, without a word being said, that whatever was written inside those envelopes belonged to a moment more private than even this small, unofficial garden gathering, that we would each need to be alone with it later, to take its full measure. She went to Anise next, and gave her the tin tied with the yellow ribbon, and told her that the small flower on the biscuits was for the flower stall where she had steadied Elara on the uneven ground, and that she had written, in the card, about what Anise had told her, that fear waits politely, until the work is done before it lets itself be felt. Because Maelin said she thought that was one of the bravest things anyone had ever told her. And she wanted Anise to have it written down somewhere she could keep it. Anise, who I had genuinely never once seen weep in 8 years of working alongside her, pressed the back of her wrist briefly against her eyes, and thanked her in a voice not quite her own. To Tomas she gave the tin with the red ribbon, the little boot-print biscuits inside, and told him again, in front of all of us this time, that he mattered, that he had mattered before Belmere Green too, even if he hadn't known it, and that she hoped the card would remind him of that on any future day when the posts felt quiet, and he wondered again whether anything he did was noticed. Tomas, 22 years old and trying so hard to be a proper soldier about the whole thing, gave up the fight entirely and simply cried, openly, unashamedly, in front of a crown prince and a princess and 3 colleagues who did not think one bit less of him for it. And I do not believe he has ever once regretted it since. And then she came to me last, exactly as she had promised herself, I think, though I did not know that at the time. She held out the tin tied with a blue ribbon, and the last envelope, and she looked up at me with an expression far more serious than any 9-year-old's face has any right to hold, and she said, "I put a ribbon on your biscuits too, the same shape as the one your father earned, because Mama helped me find a picture of one in the old book in the library, and I wanted it to be right. And in the card I wrote something I need you to actually read, not just keep in the drawer. Will you promise you'll read it properly tonight when you're alone?" I promised her that I would, and I have kept that promise more than once in the years since. What happened next in that garden I have thought about many times, because it was so unlike anything I had ever experienced in the whole of my career, and so unlike anything I have experienced since. There was no dismissal, no formal closing to the occasion, no signal that told us the moment was finished, and we might return to the ordinary business of being guards again. Princess Elara came forward from beneath the old apple tree, leaning on her cane, and embraced each of us in turn, briefly and without ceremony, murmuring something private to each of us that I will not repeat here, because I think some words are given to be kept rather than passed along. Crown Prince Rowan shook each of our hands, and when he came to me, he held it a moment longer than the others, and told me quietly that he had not fully understood, before that afternoon, quite what his wife's safety had cost the 4 of us to protect, in ways that had nothing to do with the single frightening minute at the fair, and everything to do with the years of ordinary vigilance that made that minute possible in the first place. I did not know what to say to that, and I do not think he expected me to say anything. I think he simply wanted it said once out loud by someone whose place it was to say it. Master Pemberton did something I had not expected of him at all. He crossed the garden, once the family had finished, and knelt an old man's careful, deliberate kneeling, mindful of his knees, so that he was nearly eye level with Princess Maelin, and told her, in a voice that had entirely lost its usual careful formality, that in 20 years of arranging the palace's grandest occasions, he did not believe he had ever once been present at anything that moved him half so much as what she had just done with a trestle table, 4 tins of biscuits, and her own 2 hands. Maelin, who had been fizzing with nervous energy through the whole of the ceremony, went suddenly and completely shy at that, the way children do when an adult's praise catches them by surprise, and simply told him that she was glad he liked it, and that he could have one of the extra biscuits from the tray if he wanted, because Greta had let her bake a few spares. Pemberton told her, quite seriously, that he would treasure it, and I am reliably informed that he did in fact eat it slowly, standing by the garden wall, watching the rest of us with an expression of such open feeling that Inez said afterward she had never once suspected the old chamberlain had it in him. It was Inez, sharp-eyed as ever even in the middle of her own tears, who first noticed the 2 small faces pressed to a gap in the garden wall, where a section of old stone had crumbled just enough, years before, to leave a narrow chink at exactly the height of a curious child. Prince Torin and Prince Bram, who had been given strict instructions to stay well away from the guardhouse garden that afternoon so as not to spoil their sister's surprise, had apparently found the instruction rather more than either of them could bear, and had crept down from the nursery wing the moment they judged the coast clear, to watch unseen, through the gap in the wall. They were not unseen for long. Inez pointed them out with a low laugh, and Maelin, catching sight of her brothers' faces wedged together in the crumbling stone, marched straight over to the wall with the outraged dignity of a general discovering a breach in her own defenses, and informed them both, through the gap, that they had promised to stay away. Bram, entirely unrepentant, informed her right back that he had kept the secret about the biscuits for 3 whole days, and had therefore earned the right to watch, and Torin, a little more sheepishly, admitted that he had simply wanted to see whether it had all gone the way she'd hoped. Maelin considered this for a moment, in the businesslike way she considered most things, and then declared, with the sudden and complete forgiveness only a 9-year-old can produce at such speed, that they could come around properly through the gate if they wanted, as long as they didn't touch anyone's tin. Both boys scrambled around within the minute, Bram arriving first and immediately attaching himself to Osric's leg, with the fearless familiarity small children reserve for guards they have known their whole short lives, demanding to know whether he too might try on the sergeant's cap. Torin, hanging back a little, came instead to where I stood, and told me with a seriousness well beyond his 11 years that he had helped guard the biscuit tins that week, and that he was glad now to have seen for himself that the work had been worth it. I told him it had been, and thanked him properly, and he seemed to grow an inch taller on the spot, the way boys of that age do when a grown man they respect tells them plainly that something they did mattered. We did not leave the garden quickly that afternoon. Greta arrived, unbidden, with a fresh pot of tea and a plate of the very same gingerbread Maelin had baked for us, and for perhaps half an hour the 8 of us, the 4 guards, the Crown Prince and Princess, Master Pemberton and Maelin herself, perched now on an ordinary chair rather than her overturned crate, looking thoroughly pleased with herself in the particular unguarded way a child looks when a long-held plan has finally, successfully, come to pass. Simply sat together in the last of the autumn light and talked, about nothing in particular, the way people talk when something important has just happened, and no one is quite ready to let the ordinary world back in yet. Tomas, still faintly red around the eyes, told Maelin a long and rambling story about his first week of training that made her laugh so hard she nearly fell off her chair. Osric let her try on his cap, which came down nearly to her nose, and pretended, with a gravity that had every one of us fighting laughter, to inspect her posture as though she were a new recruit. It is, I think, one of the happiest half-hours I have ever spent in my life, and I did not fully understand until the light began to fail and the household called us back to our ordinary duties, quite how rare a thing it is for a guard to be allowed, for even half an hour, to simply be a person sitting in a garden, rather than a post that happens to be occupied. I opened it that same evening in my small room at the lodging house, by the light of a single lamp, with my father's own ribbon lying beside it on the table where I had finally, for the first time in years, taken it out of its drawer. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of the cream-colored paper, and on it, in Maelin's careful, looping hand, beneath a small drawing of 4 figures in red standing close around a 5th in pale blue, she had written, "Dear Guardsman Ashby, you held my mother's hand the whole way to the carriage, and you never let her see that yours was bleeding, because you didn't want her to worry about you when you were supposed to be the one keeping her safe. I think that is the bravest kind of quiet there is. I think your father would be very proud of you, and I think it is all right for you to be proud of yourself too, and to wear his ribbon if you want to, because I think being a guard like him is not the same as being invisible like him. You can be both his and yourself at the same time. Thank you for keeping my mother safe. Love, Maelin." I sat with that letter for a long while that evening. I am not, by nature, a man given to displays of feeling, and I will not pretend to you that I wept, though I came close enough that I am not entirely certain the distinction matters. What I can tell you is that the next morning, for the first time in the 11 years since my father's passing, I opened that drawer, took out the ribbon, and pinned it quietly beneath the collar of my tunic, where no regulation required it and none forbade it either. A small, private thing, worn for myself and for him, and in some way I have never quite found the words for a 9-year-old girl who had somehow understood, better than I had ever managed to understand it myself, that a man could carry his father's honor and his own, side by side, without either one crowding out the other. I wrote to my mother that same week, something I did every month regardless, but that particular letter I remember more clearly than most of the others I have sent her over the years. I told her about the garden, about the biscuits and the cards, about the ribbon now pinned beneath my collar where it had never been before. She wrote back faster than she usually did, in the small, careful hand that had grown a little less steady with the years but had never once lost its warmth, and told me that my father had worn his own father's medal the same way, hidden beneath his collar rather than displayed on his chest, for almost exactly the same reason I had just discovered for myself, that some honors are not meant to be shown to the world, only carried close, where only the man wearing them, and perhaps the people who love him, ever need to know they are there. She told me she had never mentioned it to me before because she had always believed it was the kind of thing a son needed to come to on his own, in his own time, rather than be told. I have kept that letter too, folded now beside Maelin's in the same small frame, because it seemed to me, reading it, that a 9-year-old girl and my own long-departed father had somehow, without ever meeting, arrived at exactly the same quiet wisdom, each in their own way, each in their own time, and that I had been fortunate enough in the end to be given both of their versions of it. Word of what had happened in the walled garden did not stay contained to the 8 of us for very long, though it never once reached the news sheets, and none of us ever intended that it should. Guards talked to other guards, the way any close-knit trade talks among itself, in the quiet hours of a shared watch or over a meal in the guardhouse mess, and within a fortnight the story had made its way, in fragments and retellings, through most of the household serving guard, growing a little in the telling the way any good story does, though I have always thought the plain truth of it needed no embellishing at all. What moved me most, in the weeks that followed, was not the story's spread but what it seemed to loosen in the people who heard it. I noticed, that winter, small unexplained kindnesses appearing here and there around the household, in a way I had not much noticed before. A scullery girl leaving a note of thanks for the guard who had walked her safely to the gatehouse on a foggy night. An elderly groundskeeper, retiring after 4 decades of service, receiving not just his customary pension send-off, but a hand-bound little book of remembrances quietly compiled by the junior staff who had worked alongside him. A young guard on the northern rotation, the very one who had taken Tomas's place at the hunting lodge without ever knowing why, finding a small thank-you note pinned to his locker from a family whose carriage he had helped free from a snowdrift, apparently inspired, he told me later, by having heard the story of the princess's garden second-hand from a cousin in the kitchens. None of it was organized. No one issued a decree that the household ought to be kinder to the people who served it. It simply seemed that once one small girl had shown an entire palace what it looked like to notice a person properly, rather than the uniform or the role they occupied. A good many other people found themselves doing, in their own small ways, something of the same. I do not know how else to explain it except to say that gratitude, when it is specific and sincerely meant, appears to be catching in a way that formal recognition rarely manages to be. A citation makes people feel that the household is generous. A 9-year-old's handwritten card, it turns out, makes people want to go and be generous themselves. Master Pemberton's grander ceremony did take place the following month, exactly as promised, in the great hall, with the household assembled and the citation read and the news sheets present to record it, and I do not want you to think I am dismissing it when I say that it mattered far less to me than the afternoon in the walled garden. It was a fine occasion. We were given proper commendations, and our names were entered into the palace record, and I stood at attention through the whole of it with the particular pride any guard feels at being formally recognized for work well done. But if you had asked me, on the drive home that evening, which of the 2 occasions I would carry with me for the rest of my life, I would not have needed even a moment to answer. I still have the letter. I keep it now not in a bottom drawer out of sight, but in the same small frame on my wall where I keep the one medal I have ever chosen to display. Not because the letter is equal in official weight to a citation, but because it is, to me, worth a great deal more than one. Osric's retirement, when it finally came some years later, is a scene I do not think I will ever stop being glad I was present for. It was a modest affair, as he had insisted it be, a gathering in the same guardhouse where he had served for more than 3 decades, a few words from the household, a toast, nothing grander than the man himself would have tolerated. Near the end of the evening, when most of the younger guards had drifted off and only a handful of us remained, his 2 grown sons among them, come up from the country to see their father properly off, Osric did something I had never once seen him do in all the years I had known him. He reached into his coat and drew out a small, worn envelope of cream-colored paper, its edges gone soft with handling, and set it on the table in front of his sons without a word of explanation, the way a man sets down something he has decided, after long consideration, is finally ready to be shared. His elder son read it first in silence, and I watched his face change as he did the faint, indulgent amusement of a man expecting some minor sentimental trinket giving way, line by line, to something far more careful. He passed it to his brother without a word, and the 2 of them sat with it between them for a long moment before either spoke. It was the younger of the 2 who finally looked up at his father and said, in a voice not entirely steady, that he had spent his whole life thinking his father's work was simply standing still in a red coat, and that he had never once, until that moment, understood what his father actually carried with him every day he put it on. Osric did not say much in reply. He rarely did. But I saw him reach over and rest his hand briefly on his son's shoulder, and I saw both his sons look at him afterward with an expression I do not think they had ever quite worn in his presence before. Not affection exactly, which they had always plainly had for him, but something closer to a kind of startled respect. The respect that comes only from finally being let all the way into a room you had not known was there. Osric told me, walking me out that evening, that he had carried that letter in his coat, folded and refolded, for years, waiting for the right moment to show it to them, and that Maelin's ceremony had given him, without either of them ever knowing it, the words to finally explain to his own children who their father actually was. Inez keeps hers folded inside her service ledger, where she says she finds it now and then, on quiet nights, and reads it over before she goes home. She told me once, years after the fact, that she still thought about that afternoon in the stable yard more than almost any other single day of her career, not because anything dramatic had happened in it, but because it was the first time in her life anyone had asked her about her own fear, as though the asking itself was a kind of gift, rather than a weakness to be managed or explained away. Tomas, who is a sergeant himself now, with recruits of his own to train, told me not long ago that he still keeps his tin, empty of biscuits for years, on a shelf in his own lodging, and that on the hardest days of training a new intake, the days when some frightened young guard half his age comes to him convinced he will never be good enough for the work, the very fear Tomas remembers carrying himself, he takes the tin down from the shelf, sets it on the table between them, and tells them the whole story, start to finish, exactly as I have told it to you. He says it is the only lesson in his repertoire that has never once failed to reach even the most discouraged recruit, because it is not a lesson about discipline or duty in the abstract. It is a lesson about being seen, and he has found in all his years training young guards since that there is no substitute for it. I think often about what it means that the truest honor any of us ever received for that ordinary, frightening Saturday came not from a citation or a news sheet or a formal ceremony in a great hall, but from a 9-year-old girl who noticed, and remembered, and would not let her gratitude be folded into something bigger than the people it belonged to. I have stood a great many posts since then, through a great many seasons, and I do not know that any of them have taught me more about the actual meaning of the work than that quiet Tuesday afternoon in a walled garden behind the East Guardhouse, with autumn light coming down soft through a bare apple tree, and 4 grown guards standing very still, the way we had been trained to stand still through everything else in our lives, and none of us quite managing it, not that day, not in front of her. She is older now, of course, though she has never entirely lost the habit of noticing things other people overlook, or of following through, quietly and completely, on a kindness once she has decided it is owed. I still see her sometimes about the palace grounds, and she still greets me when she does, with a particular warmth that I do not think she extends quite so freely to every guard she passes, though I have never once heard her make anyone else feel less for it. I do not need her to say anything more than hello. I carry the rest of it with me always, folded now not into a drawer but into the everyday weight of the work itself. The knowledge that on one ordinary autumn afternoon, a child too young to know the proper size of a grown-up gratitude had gone ahead and made it exactly the right size anyway, and in doing so had given 4 tired, watchful guards something no medal has ever quite managed to give us. The plain, sustaining certainty that we had been seen, not as guards in general but as ourselves, and that it had mattered. I think back, sometimes, to that marshal I told you about at the very start of all this, pinning a bar of ribbon to my chest on some formal parade ground years before I ever met Princess Maelin, saying words about valor I no longer remember. I do not begrudge him those words, or the medal, or the ceremony that carried it. It is a fine thing to be recognized by an institution for work well done, and I would not tell any young guard starting out in this profession to want for it any less. But I understand now, in a way I did not understand standing on that parade ground, why the medal alone never quite settled the question it seemed meant to answer. An institution can tell you that your service mattered to the kingdom. It takes someone smaller than that, someone who has no institutional reason to thank you at all, who thanks you only because she noticed, and remembered, and could not rest until the noticing had been properly said out loud, to tell you that it mattered to a single, particular, unrepeatable person. And that is a different thing entirely, and I do not think any amount of ribbon can quite reach it. That, in the end, is the whole of what I wanted to tell you. Not a story of danger or of duty tested against violence, because there was very little of either in it in the end. Just a small girl, a fallen fence, 4 frightened minutes on an ordinary Saturday, and the long, patient, wholehearted work of a child who decided that the people who had kept her mother safe deserved to be thanked properly, not as symbols, not as an idea of service, but as themselves. I have carried that afternoon with me through every year since, and I expect I will go on carrying it for every year still to come. It is, without any doubt in my mind, the finest thing that has ever been given to me in the whole of my service, and I do not expect that any medal I am ever offered again will change that.